Over this past year, I've been chronicling every game I've played and making small videos on them, and I thought it'd be fun to put them all together into one big video so that you could seamlessly watch me talk about all of them. Another big reason I decided to actually put this together is because I started the series in February of last year, meaning there is no January video, and that kind of annoys me as I'd like to have the full year accounted for. At this point, it would be weird to release a standalone games I played in January of 2023 video, so I made the section and put it in here. So yeah, let's travel back in time and get into what I played in 2023, starting with January. I began the month by replaying BioShock Infinite. It used to be my favorite game of all time, and this replay cemented it as a game I think is fine, but it just doesn't do all that much for me anymore. The criticism Infinite often gets is that while it's a competent enough shooter, the gameplay strays so far from the first two titles that it loses the BioShock identity almost entirely. I'm always a bit wary of this "it's a fine game but not a good X game" line of thought, as I do think it's important for developers to experiment and evolve what a series does if that's what's creatively fulfilling to them. But as my tastes have changed, I can confidently say that the style of play that started the series is so much more interesting than what Infinite offers. It's largely shooting gallery after shooting gallery where you're limited to just 2 guns at a time and whatever you may find on the ground. The Vigors have some interesting ways that can be comboed together, but there aren't that many instances where you need to be strategic about how you use them. This leads to less memorable fights and a lack of meaningful character progression. This isn't to say that it's never fun or satisfying to play, but given what qualities I look for in games now, I just don't find this approach to be nearly as engaging as what it could be. I also did not vibe with the story like I once did. It's one I used to take very seriously, but now I think the best way to enjoy it is by turning your brain off and not thinking about it too much. With that said, I am glad that I used to take it so seriously, as it got me interested in games in a way I hadn't been before. I wanted to talk about it with anyone who would listen, and that is certainly how I've gotten here today. Honestly, I think it's kind of funny that the title that made me want to start looking deeper into games because I loved it so much eventually became one I didn't really care for because I kept looking into it deeper, and I'm not sure I would have reached this point had I never felt that initial spark with Infinite. Constants and variables or whatever, you know? Anyway, after finishing Infinite, I went right into Burial at Sea, as I wanted to see if I had fallen out of love with that as well, and the answer is yeah, but I did enjoy it more than the base game. Rapture is just such a good setting, and getting to see some of its most infamous players again was a lot of fun. Also, the level design, while still pretty in line with the rest of Infinite, took a few cues from those older games in terms of having bigger open spaces to explore in a less linear fashion. It's still a long way off from BioShock 2 and especially BioShock 1, but some areas were more interesting design-wise than anything the base game of Infinite had to offer. Of course, the big thing about Burial at Sea is its story, which manages to make an already messy narrative even messier while also dragging every other story in the BioShock canon with it. With that said, I didn't hate playing it, especially part 2 where you get to be Elizabeth. The gameplay is more stealth focused, which is an interesting challenge that shifts things away from the tired shooting galleries of Infinite and more towards something you'd expect from a BioShock game. And while the story does very much go off the rails, it at least ends on an emotional high note. Ultimately, Burial at Sea is a confusing ending to a confusing series, and it unfortunately just isn't my thing anymore, but there was some enjoyment to be had with it. With all of the parts of BioShock Infinite cleared, I jumped into A Plague Tale: Requiem. I enjoyed the first game a fair bit as I found the setting and story to be intriguing, and thought certain aspects of the gameplay presented unique challenges, and I'm glad to say that the sequel lives up to its predecessor in most ways. The environments continue to be stunning, the set pieces continue to be thrilling, and the combat continues to be an interesting challenge. It does almost everything the first one does, but bigger, and in some cases this is better. The production of it really is incredible, but in other instances this increase in scope leads to some pacing issues and a bit of bloat. On more than one occasion, I found myself thinking I was close to the end of a section only to be shown that I'd barely even started it, leading to long gaps between anything all that important happening. This sense is compounded even further by the game's approach to combat. Confrontation is dangerous, as the main character Amicia is not an action hero. She certainly is capable within her ranged skill set, but she's almost powerless when enemies are close, so in most instances stealth is the best option, as just being seen lowers your chances of survival dramatically. This makes small mistakes pretty costly, which does create some nice tension, but that can quickly turn to frustration when you have to replay sections over and over again because you keep getting spotted in ways that don't feel all that fair. Luckily, this didn't happen to me a ton, but it did come up enough for me to notice it. Additionally, while I largely enjoyed the story, it does one thing that annoyed me a lot, which is that whenever you kill an enemy, Amicia's companions comment on it with remarks like, "A bit much, isn't it?" Well, I don't mind when games try to make me question the way I engage with the main mechanic. A lot of the time, it just doesn't make that much sense here. Like, most of the people Amicia kills are slavers who you watch murder countless innocent civilians, and anytime they see you, they try to kill you. So constantly getting chastised by other characters for defending yourself against unambiguous bad guys that are attempting to murder you is pretty annoying. All that aside, I'd still easily recommend it, as well as the first one, to anyone who enjoys cinematic titles like The Last of Us. Despite some hiccups and annoyances, there's plenty to enjoy here, and I'd argue it's worth checking out for some of the environments alone. And speaking of games with great environments, once I was done with Requiem, I decided to go back to the BioShock well and replay the other two games in the series for the first time in maybe a decade to see how they compare to Infinite. And yeah, I really enjoyed diving back into Rapture. BioShock 1 holds up surprisingly well. It's got great level design and fun environmental storytelling, which makes it a blast to explore, a ton of cool abilities that give players a good bit of versatility to how they approach any encounter, and a solid cast of villains who bring a tremendous amount of intrigue to the goings-on of this little city under the sea. I will say switching between weapons and plasmids is a bit unwieldy and is probably the aspect of the game that feels the most dated, but as the combat mostly takes a backseat to the exploration, it didn't bother me too much. What did bother me though was the last fourth of the game. I entirely forgot how rough it is. The section where you become a Big Daddy brings the pace of the game to a screeching halt, and you're tasked with a tedious escort mission while having to wear a helmet that shrinks your FOV massively. I originally played it on console, so I didn't remember this part bothering me much, but playing it on PC while closer to a monitor made me so nauseous. It kind of shocks me that this made it into the game. It doesn't ruin it by any means, but it is a sour note to end an otherwise pretty great experience. All in all, there is a reason BioShock is still talked about today, and even though some aspects haven't aged the best, it still has good bones, and that's helped it stand the test of time. The most surprising thing to come out of this replay of the series was me realizing that BioShock 2 is actually my favorite. I don't know, I think it does some things worse than the first game. Like, the level design of Rapture and 2, while pretty solid, feels like it was designed to be a video game instead of an actual place. While this isn't inherently bad, I think the first game did a better job of making its areas both believable environments and fun to play within. Also, even though its story is serviceable, it didn't leave nearly as much of an impact on me. There is some good stuff here, but it doesn't feel as groundbreaking. However, its gameplay is so much smoother and fun that the slight deficits in these other categories are hard to care that much about. Dual-wielding guns and plasmids just makes too much sense, and I really hope that if there ever is a remake of the original game, they update it with this combat system. There are just so many little improvements that make it more enjoyable to play. Like, it found a way to somehow make the terrible escort mission from the first game a fun and central part of the gameplay loop. It improved the upgrade camera by making it more engaging than just getting close to an enemy and snapping their picture. It simplified hacking so that you're not playing an entirely different game every few minutes, and it added some new really cool enemies that are a ton of fun to fight against, the most notable being the Big Sisters. These aspects make up for the few shortcomings and then some. As I was finishing up BioShock 2, I couldn't help but feel like the perfect BioShock game existed somewhere between 1 and 2. One with the design sensibilities and narrative prowess of the original, and the gameplay and quality of life features of the second. And I was super happy to learn that this actually exists with BioShock 2's DLC, Minerva's Den. It is far and away my favorite piece of BioShock content. It melds everything that makes the first two games so great and trims the fat that weighed them down. Frankly, its shorter runtime helps make every moment feel important, and it in no way overstays its welcome, which I'd argue pretty much every full-length BioShock game has. It is just so smartly written, tightly designed, and fun to play. I had never gotten to it before now, and it was the perfect way to send off the series. It just really feels like it understands what makes BioShock great, and it also helped pave the way for this kind of expansion DLC by showing how much can be accomplished even in a smaller package. Yeah. It's just a really awesome time that I think everyone should check out, regardless of if you played any other BioShock game. To end off the month, I played Going Under, a roguelike dungeon crawler set in a corporate incubator where you explore the ruins of failed startups to attain power or something. The plot doesn't really matter, but it is all very fun and very goofy. The writing is clever, and everything from power-ups to enemies ties into this central theme, and it manages to be engaging the whole time. Like most roguelikes, the gameplay is centered around killing things with with weapons and powers you find in each run, and various wrinkles are added on to keep things from getting stale. One aspect I think works really well here that I'm sure Breath of the Wild haters will despise is that durability plays a huge factor, so you're regularly trying out new weapons and finding the perfect time to throw them at the enemy to get one last big hit in. It all feels pretty good. I'm not the biggest fan of roguelikes, so it takes one being pretty fun for me to want to put the time into finishing it, and between the entertaining writing and enjoyable enough gameplay, I felt compelled to, although I didn't have much interest in continuing to play it after rolling credits. Granted, I don't think there is all that much to do after beating it, at least not nearly as much as many other roguelikes. So yeah, I guess while this didn't really matter to me as having a high total playtime is not something I care about when playing a game, I know for many fans of the genre, it is. So if you give it a shot, don't expect it to be the only game you play for the next year. Regardless, it's definitely worth trying, especially for more casual fans of roguelikes. And that brings us to February. I played a stupid amount of games in February. Like, it might be the most amount of games I've ever played in a single month, and the vast majority of them were really good. And that started with Citizen Sleeper. The thing about Citizen Sleeper is it is kind of a hard game to convince people to check out, as the actual gameplay doesn't look all that compelling, and trying to describe it arguably is even less compelling. It is a narrative-based, combatless, role-playing game centered around time and resource management set in a cyberpunk world. And while that may make it seem like it would only appeal to a niche audience, I think a ton of people who might be inclined to pass on it based on that description would adore it. The comparison I'm about to make is admittedly a bad one, as Citizen Sleeper doesn't play anything like the game I'm going to mention, but throughout my time with it, I had a very similar feeling to the one I got when playing Stardew Valley for the first time. Again, these games really aren't alike at all. However, the thing they do have in common is that you can only accomplish so much during any given in-game day, but there are tons of interesting things you want to do. And there is something just so addictive about that kind of gameplay loop. I found myself continuously saying, okay, I'll just do one more cycle and then be done, until I ended up pretty much beating it in one sitting. And while it isn't a super long game, it's not all that short either, taking me about 7 hours to get through. And the wild thing is that I've talked to many other people who had the exact experience I did of not putting the game down until they beat it, which I think is a pretty good endorsement. While I think the gameplay does a good job of giving you a consistent dosage of dopamine, where it really shines is in its story and the many directions that story can go based on your decisions and success at managing your time and resources. It's a special game that I think a lot of people will miss because of how niche it seems, but I truly believe that most people would enjoy it, and it is one of the easiest recommendations I can give. Sticking with the cyberpunk theme, after Citizen Sleeper, I played Ghostrunner, which was a lot of fun. I've always been a big fan of first-person games with cool movement, stuff like Titanfall 2 and Mirror's Edge, and I think Ghostrunner takes a lot of what those titles established and raises the bar to a new level. Learning how to utilize the various movement options not only to get through the game, but to get through the game quickly is a joy. Also, it just does some stuff that I think is kind of fun, like having its upgrade system be this sort of mini game where the different moves and abilities are pretty much Tetris blocks, and you only have so much space to place them, which means you not only have to choose which abilities you think will be most valuable for your playthrough, but you also have to find a formation that allows you to maximize the amount of upgrades you have. And I can see a lot of people hating that sort of thing, but I find it really cool. All in all, it's a really fun and tight game that does try out a few experimental things that won't work for everyone, but I think are pretty cool to see. Next up, I played Maquette, which is a narrative puzzle game where the main mechanic is that there is a little model of the area you are in, and when you place an item in that model, it will show up in the actual area, but to scale. It's a cool idea that they do a fair bit with, but I never found solving the puzzles to be all that satisfying. In my experience, they were either too easy or obscure in a way that was just kind of annoying to solve. I rarely walked away from a puzzle feeling a sense of accomplishment, which I think is the opposite of what you want when playing a puzzle game. I also didn't find the story to be all that compelling. It's about the relationship of a pretty rom-com-y couple, and maybe some people will find relatability in that story, but I largely found it to be unoriginal and predictable. That doesn't make it inherently bad, it's just that it didn't do much for me, and when combined with the lackluster puzzles, I found the experience as a whole to be a bit disappointing. And while talking about games that left me feeling disappointed, that leads me to the next game I played, which was Kentucky Route Zero. By all means, I should love this game. Like, it seems made for English majors who adore video games. And while there certainly are aspects of it I found interesting, I just couldn't get into it. Since finishing it, I have watched a few videos that have gotten me to appreciate the game a bit more for both the story it tells and how it tells it, but that hasn't made me retroactively like it or anything like that. In fact, it more so has just bummed me out that instead of being moved by the game while playing it, I was mostly just bored. Where I would recommend something like Citizen Sleeper to pretty much anyone, Kentucky Route Zero is definitely a niche game that will work amazingly well for some, but be a little too out there for most. With that said, I would not discourage anyone from playing it, as at the very least, it is a very interesting game to talk about, and I've gotten a lot of enjoyment from both hearing why some people love it and also whinging about aspects of its story with others who found it underwhelming. And then I played the Dead Space remake, which I don't really have a ton to say about aside from that it's really good. It has been forever since I played Dead Space, so I didn't really notice all the ways that the remake is different, but while playing it, it felt the way I remember the game feeling back when I first tried it 15 years ago. I know that if I replayed the original, that wouldn't be the case, as the remake improved things in countless ways, but what matters is that they modernized it in a way that made it fun to play in current year without taking away what made Dead Space feel like Dead Space in the first place, which I think is a sign of a great remake. And while in games from the 2000s, I also replayed Assassin's Creed 2, which was an interesting experience. AC2 is a massively important game in that it influenced the direction of open world titles immensely, for better and for worse. I truly think it is one of the most consequential titles of the past 20 years, and as its consequences have been fully realized, I've definitely soured on it a fair bit, as I don't love the direction it helped push the industry. With that said, I did find some enjoyment in it. Like, I forgot how cool Ezio is. I didn't replay Brotherhood or try Revelations, but I was tempted to just to see his story. He is certainly not my favorite video game protagonist of all time, but he is up there as he has a ton of charm to him. But yeah, it's a classic game that comes from an era that hasn't aged super well, and while I didn't find that much enjoyment playing it, at the very least it was nice to refresh my thoughts on it. For those counting, that is 6 games so far that I beat in February, which is actually only just past the halfway point. I may have gone a bit too hard this month. The next game I played was Kena Bridge of Spirits, and I don't really know how to fully explain it, but dang, do I just really love this game. It uses its core mechanics in clever ways for platforming, puzzle solving, and combat. Every ability has many uses, and while many of its mechanics are simple, they are also used rather effectively. But beyond that, there's just something about the art style and storytelling that I found incredibly moving. It was a world I loved playing in and learning about, and I don't know that that kind of connection can be made from just looking at gameplay footage. I remember hearing a lot of hype for this game before release due to its art style being so impressive, but despite it reviewing pretty well, it seemed to fall off the map completely when it actually came out, which is a bummer, as I think there is a lot about the game that is worth talking about both in terms of its themes and gameplay mechanics. I definitely say it's worth a look for anyone who likes fairly open action adventure games. The title I played after Kena had an equally impressive although very different art style, that being Hi-Fi Rush. This game has been hyped up so much due to its shadow drop and core gimmick, and you know, I can't blame anyone who has hyped it up for these reasons. It's really cool. I don't play a lot of character action games, so I don't really know how it stacks up to others, but I think part of why I enjoyed it so much is that as every attack is timed to the music, it made it way easier for me to pull off combos. The limitation of executing inputs on the beat sounds like it will make things more difficult, but I think it just gave a really good frame that helped prime me for success, which is great because for the few character action games I have played, I normally feel like garbage at them. The game looks and feels like a Saturday morning cartoon, and while it isn't revolutionary by any means, it is an extremely solid title that succeeds at pretty much everything it tries to do. If you think you'd like it, you'll probably like it. Once I beat Hi-Fi Rush, I jumped into the Case of the Golden Idol, and gosh dang if this isn't my kind of video game. It is a puzzler reminiscent in some ways to Return of the Obra Dinn, where you are shown a single moment just after a character's death and must examine the scene to figure out what exactly happened. I don't want to show too much footage or talk about it in depth all that much, as I think it is in the category of game where the less you know, the better, but while I don't think that it hits the same heights as something like Obra Dinn, there are definitely many aha moments that made my brain explode with excitement. Where Maquette's puzzles left me underwhelmed, many of the ones in the Case of the Golden Idol felt rewarding to figure out. It is a special little game, and I hope to keep seeing more stuff like it, as these sorts of puzzle games have proven to be some of my favorite titles in recent memory. After that, I played through Sable, which is a game that has been on my radar since release, but anytime I saw gameplay of it, it made me not all that interested in playing it for myself. Something about how the gameplay looked just didn't appeal to me, but I'm glad to say that I was being stupid and should have played it sooner. The most most obvious inspiration for Sable is Breath of the Wild, and while being inspired by Breath of the Wild is pretty commonplace in today's gaming landscape, it is one of the few titles that I feel truly understands what makes Breath of the Wild so enjoyable, and that mostly comes down to its general structure as well as its use of space. The main goal is for Sable, the protagonist, to explore the world in order to discover what her path in life should be, but instead of this being done through some sort of quest line with a set story, it is done through the activities you choose to engage with. As you explore the world and help various people, you earn different masks that represent professions and ways of life Sable could choose. This makes everything you do feel important to the journey because in some way it is informing the person your version of Sable will become. A handful of hours into the game, I had gotten a few masks and was given the option to essentially end the story, but I didn't feel like I had figured out what was right for Sable yet, and I went on to play for another 10 hours before I did. And I think that's really cool. I felt truly in control of the pace of the story, which is pretty rare in video games. This structure, mixed with a world rife with breathtaking landmarks and an intriguing history, makes it an easy recommendation for those who like exploration games that give you some actual freedom. I will say though that I had some issues with how the game ran. Like, I encountered way more glitches while playing it than I normally do with games, the worst of which were audio-based ones that kind of disrupted some of the chill vibes of traversing the sands. I played on PC, so it is possible that it is more stable on console, as that seems to be the case pretty often these days. With that said, I found the core gameplay to be so enjoyable that I was more than happy to play through the bugs I encountered, but I know not everyone will be, so just take that into consideration. Oh, also, the soundtrack is absolutely incredible, and I've been listening to a handful of tracks in it on repeat since finishing the game. Very good. And speaking of banger soundtracks, that brings me to the final game I played in February, Everhood. Over the past decade, there's been a rise in Earthbound-inspired RPGs, obviously Undertale being the most notable of which. And I think one of the more interesting things about Everhood is that it is far more inspired by Undertale itself than it is by Earthbound. Two pretty notable features of Undertale are its incredible soundtrack and its intense bullet hell combat. And Everhood melds those two things together by combining the music and bullet hell aspects to make a rhythm game of sorts. And it's pretty rad. I won't talk much about it beyond that as I don't want to get too spoilery, but I also think it does some pretty interesting things with its narrative by building off some of the ideas that Undertale established with its story. While you definitely can play Everhood on its own and enjoy it, I do think that Undertale is sort of required reading to fully appreciate it, even though they aren't made by the same people or set in the same world or anything like that. But they do feel connected spiritually in a way. So yeah, check it out if you want, or don't, or maybe you have, I don't know. Just do whatever. Then we've got March. I had a strong start to the month with Nobody Saves the World, a sort of hack and slash indie game with a really good hook that kept things fresh for the entire playthrough. The premise is that you're this weird little guy known as Nobody on a quest to save the world. Nobody is pretty useless in terms of combat and puzzle solving, but he is able to change his form into things that are far more useful. So like pretty early on, you get access to a rat form that allows you to quickly attack enemies and poison them over time, a ranger form to shoot things from a distance, and a guard form that's all about tanking hits and doing up close and personal damage. As you level up each form, new moves and forms unlock, and you also get the ability to mix and match certain moves across the forms, creating a really satisfying loop where you constantly have new options to change up the gameplay in interesting ways. Aside from there just being options, it also does a good job of incentivizing players to actually try them instead of just sticking to one thing. For example, there are certain dungeons where enemies can only be hurt by a specific attack type. So if, let's say, they can only be hurt by piercing damage, then you have to use a form that can do piercing damage. It's a simple yet effective way to push players to try new things. Beyond this, the entire leveling system not only encourages players to use different forms, but also pushes them to try out interesting and useful combinations of moves. Instead of getting experience from just killing enemies, you get it from doing certain tasks. So if you're in horse form, you might get a quest to hit a certain number of enemies while galloping, and doing so will get you a chunk of experience. These quests get more complex and out there as the game goes on, and sometimes require using abilities from two different forms, adding even more layers to the combat. I could keep explaining all of the various gameplay systems, but I think the more I try to do that, the more confusing it might start to sound, so I'll leave it there. Ultimately though, it is a mechanically rich game with the kind of progression system that just makes your brain feel good. I will say, even though it was on my radar for a long time, it did take me a while to actually start playing, as I was a little turned off by its art style. I don't think it's bad by any means, and it definitely definitely works well within the game, but for whatever reason, it did make me less interested in trying it. This happens to me more often than I'd like to admit, but I also don't think it's that out of the ordinary. With so many games out there to play, sometimes you just have to make judgments based on what you see at a glance. You know, too many games, not enough time. I say all of this mostly to encourage anyone who doesn't think they'd like the game based on the art style to check it out anyway, as it is tons of fun and definitely worth playing. Anyway, once I finished that, I moved on to The Looker, which is a parody of the 2015 cult classic puzzle game, The Witness. It essentially presents puzzles that look similar to those of The Witness, but all of them are solved in goofier yet way more straightforward ways. Obviously, the only way this game will make any sense to you is if you've played The Witness, but to be honest, it is hard to know who will like it more, people that love The Witness or people that hated it. It does a handful of things that could definitely be seen as mocking its source material, and I imagine people who found The Witness to be pretentious would find those things to be funny and validating. But also there are a few moments that make it seem like the developer, The Looker, has a lot of reverence and respect for The Witness. I think fans of it would be able to pick those moments out easily. So it stands in this interesting spot where I imagine it would appeal to both camps for entirely different reasons. And I'd say that makes it a pretty successful parody, as its intent can be interpreted in multiple different ways. As for if you should play it, you know, I don't know, it's free, takes about an hour or two to beat, and has a few really fun moments. So if you play The Witness, you'll probably get something out of it, and it's a really low investment. Hard to come out a loser in that kind of situation. After that, I played Wolong Fallen Dynasty, and it was pretty good. Currently, my favorite FromSoft game is Sekiro, so I've been looking for titles that scratch a similar itch, and Wolong largely succeeded at that. Its combat primarily centers around parrying, and it uses a system that is similar in a lot of ways to the posture system in Sekiro, where attacking and parrying creates buildup on a gauge, and once it fills up all the way, you can do a big old attack for massive damage. This part of the gameplay loop is a lot of fun and generally feels really good. As for its other systems, it throws a lot of shit at the wall, and while I did beat the game, I don't know if I've put enough time in yet to fully say how effective all of these systems are. Like, it has a whole magic tree with some pretty powerful spells and some cool ideas, but it feels a bit tacked on, and it doesn't seem like the game is balanced around it, although it could be way more important in New Game Plus. There are also companions that automatically join you at the start of levels, along with an option for online co-op. Although I didn't really use either all that much, as I found having other characters around really just made the fight stupidly hectic and a bit too easy, as the focus of enemies, especially bosses, would be split. From the little bit of co-op I did do, it was a ton of fun to work through the levels with a friend, and I appreciated how easy it was for us to get connected and stay connected compared to the way it typically works in FromSoft games. But also, it was massively glitchy, which pretty much made it impossible to play at times. Arguably the most important mechanic in the game comes in the form of morale rank, which is a system that makes each of the stages have a nice challenge to them regardless of if you're over leveled or not. Essentially, when you begin a new stage, you start at rank 1 morale, and if you face enemies of a higher morale, they will deal far more damage to you, making those encounters much riskier. They're not impossible by any means, but they take way more skill to pull off. If you die, you lose all your morale, so you have to always think twice about what you're actually able to take on. As you kill enemies and plant flags on the battlefield, your morale goes up, and with the flag specifically, the more you place, the higher your minimum morale becomes. So instead of getting set back to 0 when you die, you get put to whatever minimum rank you've earned. It's a cool system that encourages exploration, leads to a fair bit of decision making, and allows players to essentially set their own difficulty. But my main issue with it, and frankly it is my main issue with many aspects of the game, is not knowing what the intended difficulty or experience is meant to be. If I'm a seasoned Souls-like player, what should I try to have my morale level set to? Should I not use magic and companions? Should I avoid upgrading things? That is often a bit of an issue that comes from games that have difficulty options baked into gameplay choices. It's hard to get a grasp on what mechanics you should or shouldn't engage with in order to strike the best balance between a fun challenge and interesting gameplay. With that said, this sort of thing is far from being a deal breaker, and I would definitely still recommend checking it out, especially if you liked Sekiro. You might have to experiment a bit to figure out what systems create the best difficulty for you, but once you figure that out, I think you'll have a lot of fun with it. Now, Wolong does have relatively terrible Steam reviews at the moment because its launch was pretty rough. Many were upset with its general performance as well as its keyboard and mouse options, which that part surprised me a bit because I would never play a game like this one on keyboard and mouse, but I guess some people do, and to each their own. I also know that a bunch of fans of Nioh, Team Ninja's other major Souls-like Ninja series, were pretty disappointed that the studio didn't just make Nioh 3 and instead went with something a bit weirder. I haven't played the Nioh video games yet, so I don't really have a strong take on this, but I do think Wolong does a bunch of interesting things that make the game worth playing. Variety is cool, and it's fun to see developers take big swings sometimes, even if it comes up a bit short. I will say, there isn't a ton of enemy variety, which makes the non-boss fights feel a little stale by the late game, but I do think the bosses mostly make up for that, as all of them are varied both visually and mechanically, and lead to pretty much all the coolest moments in the game. So yeah, play it if any of this sounded appealing to you. After Wolong, I played How to Say Goodbye, an indie puzzle game about death. For the most part, its puzzles hit that sweet spot of being just difficult enough to make you think about them for a little bit, but never too difficult where you get stuck or frustrated trying to find a solution. And its story, while not the most in-depth one ever made, offers a handful of ideas and themes that are important to reflect on, and depending on your life experience, you may find very moving. It is pretty short, which I know may be a sticking point for some people as they want to get the maximum amount of time per dollar they can, so if you're that type of person, this probably is not the puzzle game for you. But for those who enjoy experiences that can be beaten in 1 or 2 sittings and always aim to be introducing players to some new mechanic, I definitely recommend giving it a look. And that brings us to the last game I played in March, which was the Resident Evil 4 Remake. RE4 has been one of my favorite games ever since it came out. That does come with the massive caveat that the last time I replayed it was over a decade ago, so I really don't remember how the moment-to-moment gameplay felt. I pretty much can only recall the bigger moments and my general feelings towards it. If you've been keeping up with my main channel, you'll know that I've recently had a bad track record with revisiting old favorites, so I was a little nervous about jumping back into RE4. With that said, the remake blew me away. Similarly to what happened for me with the Dead Space remake, as my memory of RE4 is so foggy, I couldn't really point out many major differences between the two versions, and as the remake was able to tap into a lot of the same energy of the original, it felt exactly the way I remember the game feeling back in 2005. Again, just as with Dead Space, that perception is obviously wrong as so much has changed between the original and remake, but what matters is that those changes didn't stick out to me while playing. They felt like they could have been in the original game. Capcom simultaneously modernized it in a way that aligned with the other recent Resident Evil remakes as well as games in general, while also staying true to the original title's vision, which is incredible. It's just a lot of fun, and I still don't understand how parrying can work so well in a third-person Resident Evil game, but it somehow does. One aspect I want to focus on for a moment that I might talk about in a bigger video but haven't decided yet is how it pitches different difficulty options to players. With most games, when looking at the description for higher difficulties, it'll say something like for seasoned fans of shooters who want to be pushed to their limits, but the RE4 remake doesn't do that. The highest difficulty option before beating the game is hardcore, and it gives the description of for players who have played Resident Evil 4 2005. This is the difficulty I played on and had a lot of fun with, but I also don't think it is the best way to recommend what difficulty you should play on. In general, it seems weird to assume that people who played RE4 would have more skill at the remake, as certain versions of the original had different difficulty options and the base game itself had a dynamic difficulty system, where enemy behavior would change based on how skilled you were, so whether or not someone has played the original doesn't give any indication of their skill level, as it was designed to be played by people with different skill levels. When I chose it, I assumed that there might be some gameplay or level changes to keep things fresh, but having compared my experience to those of others, hardcore doesn't do anything that can't be experienced when playing on the other difficulties. This isn't really a big deal, but I do find it interesting how certain games communicate their difficulty options, and this is one of the stranger approaches I've seen. That aside, the RE4 remake is an absolute joy. I expect to be replaying it a few more times in the near future, and in general, it's just awesome to see another remake that supports its source material while also bringing the gameplay into the modern age. With all those covered, that takes us to April. I started off with Tchia, an open-world indie game that might have the best-looking sunsets in all of video games. In it, you play as Tchia, a girl who can take control of objects and animals on a quest to save her dad. Pretty clearly, the game takes a handful of cues from Breath of the Wild, but unfortunately not really in the ways that would benefit it most. Like from a structural standpoint, it presents a handful of mandatory missions that have some variance in terms of the order you can tackle them, but do still have that waypoint to waypoint feel. For the most part, there isn't all that much of a reason to explore the open world. There are a few useful upgrades you can find, like ones that increase stamina and ones that allow you to possess things for longer, but the vast majority of stuff you can collect is for cosmetic purposes, which may be enough incentive for some people, but it didn't get me invested in exploring the world more than I had to. The mechanic of possessing objects and animals is pretty cool, but most of the applications are relatively surface level. It's used for a few puzzles and general traversal, but not much else, and I would have loved to see a few more creative ways to use the various forms. One thing I think is worth mentioning mentioning is that the biggest inspiration for the game is the island of New Caledonia, which is where the co-founders of the studio are from. And this is something that the game itself makes abundantly clear. There's a pop-up at the start that explains that while Tchia is set in a fictional world, it draws heavy inspiration from New Caledonian culture, music, traditions, landscapes, and a bunch of other things. This knowledge puts a handful of gameplay choices into perspective. One of the main goals of the developers was to recreate the feeling of their home in this fictional world, so they included mechanics and elements that maybe don't add all that much to the core gameplay loop, but do succeed in establishing a setting that pays homage to New Caledonia. And what I find interesting about this is that normally I would want to criticize some of these elements as being unneeded fluff and just distracting from the most important parts of the game, but knowing the intent of the developers made me appreciate these things more than anything else. It shifted my expectations a bit, so I not only approached it as a video game, but also as a way to experience the vibe of a real place. To be honest, it's rare for developers to be this open about their inspirations and intent, especially within the game itself. Typically, you only hear this sort of thing in interviews, so it's interesting to see them communicate so openly about it. And I think it was a smart choice, because it at least helped me approach certain decisions they made with a more open mind. All in all, it's a chill game with some fascinating aspects that may have the same somewhat tired structure most open world games have been using for as long as I can remember, but it does stand out in other intriguing ways that keep things fresh. Also, there's a mechanic that lets you attempt to do flips and shit whenever you want, and it makes going from place to place so much more fun than it has any business being. So yeah, if you're looking for a shorter open world game, give it a look. After that, I played Dredge, a cosmic horror fishing game which, is not a genre I expected us to get to soon, but I sure am glad exists. In it, you captain a ship with the goal of finding fish, materials, treasure, and of course, cursed objects that I'm sure will not lead to any sorts of consequences. Each day, you try to gather as much stuff as you can before nightfall, as once it gets dark, it takes a toll on your character's psyche, which can lead to various bad things happening, many of which revolve around unspoken horrors of the sea. As you collect more stuff, you can get upgrades for your ship that allow you to go faster and carry more things, all aiding in your search for the various cursed objects. The core gameplay loop is satisfying and gets you in that just one more day headspace that all the best games do. There's this constant balance of trying to get things done quickly so you don't get stuck sailing at night, but also pushing your luck a bit so you can get more done in a day. On top of that, there are certain fish and occurrences that only happen at night, so sometimes you have to stay in the water after the sun goes down. This all leads to a lot of tension as you try to maximize your yield each day without letting your ship get damaged or sink. But this is where the biggest problem with Dredge arises, as there isn't a good consequence for any form of failure. For instance, when your ship takes damage, certain slots in your hull can no longer be used. Sometimes this leads to having less storage, but other times it causes damage to important items like your engines. When this happens, all you can do is slowly drift towards the nearest port. Depending on where you're at, this can take a pretty long time and also use up a decent bit of resources in order to repair it. And for the most part, it just feels like a waste of time and resources because it doesn't lead to anything. The worst part is that most of the time when this sort of thing happens, you're better off just sinking your ship, as the only consequence is having to load from your last save, which given the frequency at which most players will dock their ship, probably will only cost them 2 to 3 minutes. This severely undercuts the game's tension. Like many horror games, the encounters are only scary if you're just able to narrowly avoid them. But once you do get hit, you realize there isn't much to be scared of. This will almost certainly be a controversial take, but I think the game would have benefited from running on some sort of larger timer where the amount of days you take to complete the main objective will influence the ending you get. There are a lot of ways to do this, and I'm not sure what exactly would have been the best approach for Dredge, but in general, I think having a bigger picture time limitation like this gives meaning to failure. Instead of reloading a save when your ship sinks, it could cost you a week, which would raise the tension of getting everything done on time. These sorts of systems can feel punishing, but I think when done well, they provide stakes and motivation that add a ton of value to a game. Not to mention, there always could be an option to play without a timer for those who don't vibe with that sort of thing. Ultimately, Dredge is a really cool game that I enjoyed and expect a lot of people will love, but it didn't hold my interest as much as I think it could have. Next up is Pizza Tower, a Wario-like 2D platformer that I think is pretty close to being a perfect game. It excels at everything it aims to do, creating a really tight, fast, and fun platformer. Its movement mechanics and general control controls provide a lot of grace for new players, allowing them to hit super fast speeds without constantly being interrupted. But it also has a high skill ceiling for those who want to master all of Peppino's movement mechanics in order to get through the levels flawlessly. It just feels really good to play. Like, this is how I wish Sonic games felt. While its art style is crude, it fits the game well and is filled with amazing animations that exude creativity. Like, Peppino reacts to the way he moves around. He doesn't just hold a single face regardless of what he's doing, and this makes him feel so dynamic. So much care was put into making these animations stand out while not being distracting, which is a hard thing to balance, but done really well here. Now, admittedly, when it comes to games like this, I'm deeply on the casual side of things. I don't have much interest in mastering the mechanics or replaying levels, but for those who do want that, Pizza Tower has so much to offer. Every level tests the player's movement skills in new ways, and if they want to achieve the highly coveted P rank, they'll be pushed to their limits. I do think this game is worth it for those who like doing single playthroughs of titles and then moving on to whatever's next. There are tons of interesting ideas and rad implementations of the game's mechanics, so I'd say if you like platformers in the slightest, this is not one to miss. But if you are the type of person who loves diving deep into a game and mastering its mechanics, you owe it to yourself to check this one out. Once I was done with Pizza Tower, I jumped into the Mageseeker, an action RPG published by Riot Forge and set in the League of Legends universe. I don't play League on principle, but ever since Arcane came out a few years ago, I've been very interested in the world of Runeterra. And I think Riot Forge's mission of hiring talented indie studios to develop a diverse set of games using the League IP is pretty cool. The developers for the Mageseeker previously made Moonlighter, which I thoroughly enjoyed, so I've had my eye on this game since it was announced, and it didn't disappoint. Going in, I knew nothing about the protagonist Silas, but his story is a complex and fascinating one, and his ability lends itself well to be a core gameplay mechanic. Essentially, he can use chains to channel the magic of other people, so while in combat, you constantly jump between absorbing the powers of enemies to unleash their own magic against them and hitting them with physical attacks. Certain types of magic is powerful against certain types of enemies, so in fighting, you often have to be strategic about the order you kill things in. Like, let's say you're fighting a bunch of fire and ice guys and kill all of the ice guys first. That then will make it much harder to take out the rest of the fire guys. So instead, it's better to spread out the damage before finishing enemies off. It's a fun system and leads to a handful of intense fights. Where the game really shines though is with its bosses. Pretty much all of them are stellar, and depending on your skill level and what difficulty you're playing on, will challenge you in just the right way. Now, there were a few things I was disappointed by, mainly that I was hoping it would have something similar to the shop in Moonlighter, and it kind of does with its whole building a rebellion thing, but all of it is pretty simple and none of the management type choices are all that meaningful. This isn't a huge issue, but given Digital Sun's skill set, I'd hope for something more complex. All in all though, it's a fun game with some great fights, and if you're looking for a way to get into League of Legends without playing League of Legends, this is a solid enough way to do so. And while on games using their IPs in unique ways, I also play The Murder of Sonic the Hedgehog, which is a visual novel released on April Fool's Day where you assist Tails in solving the murder of Sonic at a murder mystery party. I don't really know what to say about the game itself, as there isn't much to it. It's got some fun writing, a good enough Sonic minigame, and a few moments where you actually have to put the mystery together, but overall it's pretty simple and mostly just serves as a cute little gimmick, which to be clear isn't a dig. I think doing an April Fool's joke like this is a lot of fun, and I love when developers use their IPs in surprising and imaginative ways. I don't personally love visual novels, so this didn't do all that much for me, but I am really happy they made it, as I want to see studios experiment with the types of games they make and not always be beholden to using their characters in only one specific way. It's also free, so that's cool too. Last up was Storyteller, a puzzle game where you are tasked with crafting a story that matches its title. With each puzzle, you are given different characters and settings, and you need to put the pieces together in a way that leads to the desired result. This starts off pretty simple, but as the game goes on and more pieces are introduced, things get way more complicated and interesting. Most of the puzzles have multiple different ways to be solved, and a few even challenge you to find these alternate ways. I do think it would have been cool if every puzzle had challenged you to find an alternate way to solve it, as I really enjoyed having to look at something I had just figured out through a new lens, but I get that not every puzzle is as interesting to solve in different ways. Now, the game is pretty short. As I've established in the past, I don't really care about the length of a game as long as it feels like a complete experience. And with Storyteller, it kind of felt like it ended right when it was starting to get really good. The last couple sets of puzzles really tap into the potential of the game, and right when I expected things to ramp up even more, it was just done. I felt like it was worth my money, but I still wanted to see more. I really hope the devs continue with this concept, as I think there is so much more there to explore, and I'd love to to see these ideas get expanded upon in a bigger project. And speaking of bigger projects, May brought about one of the biggest games of the year, and unsurprisingly, I played a lot of it. But it wasn't the only thing I played this month. As Tears of the Kingdom didn't come out until May 12th, I originally planned to use the time before its release to replay Shovel Knight and all of its expansions, but due to poor time management on my part, I only ended up making it through the base game. But even just playing that reminded me that there is just so much goodness to Shovel Knight. It nails that old school 2D platformer vibe in a way that both pays homage to what came before and also feels fresh. There aren't many games with as much polish as Shovel Knight, and even though it's almost a decade old, it still feels monumental in so many ways. It is a testament to the timelessness of certain ideas and titles, and I will never not be impressed by what Yacht Club accomplished. Every stage is expertly crafted, and there are so many ways to utilize the various items to get through them as efficiently as possible. Despite its linear nature, due to all the tools at your disposal, there is still a ton of player freedom. On top of that, all of the boss fights are stellar, and it has an all-timer soundtrack. It just feels so good to play. Shovel Knight obviously is a very popular indie game, so you probably don't need me to tell you to play it, but I'm going to. Honestly, if you haven't played Shovel Knight yet, what are you doing? Just play it. It's too good to be in your backlog still. I promise it's worth it. The rest of my month, of course, was spent playing Tears of the Kingdom, and to no one's surprise, I loved it. As the experience is so fresh, it's hard to say where it ranks amongst my favorite Zelda games and just games in general. There's always a lot of hype right when something comes out, which can skew my feelings on it, and it also can just take a while until I fully understand the emotional connection I have to a thing. So with all games I play, I like to give it some time to settle into its proper spot before making strong declarations like it being the best of all time or anything like that. What I will say though is that I don't think I've ever been as consistently impressed while playing a game as I was while playing Tears of the Kingdom. I also don't know that I've ever had more fun while playing a game. Despite it being the same Hyrule, despite knowing the modern Zelda formula and the tricks Nintendo likes to pull out of their sleeves, it gave me the same feeling I had when playing Breath of the Wild, which I thought was impossible. It improves on its predecessor in most ways, although I do want to be clear that it's not better in all ways, which is an opinion that I've seen going around a decent bit that I think is kind of goofy. But I get why people are so excited about it. There's just so much to this game, and I can pretty much guarantee that I will be talking about it on my main channel for the next ever. As for this video though, I'm just going to start dropping a bunch of various thoughts that I have about Tears of the Kingdom without much rhyme or reason. As it's a long game and it's only been out for a short amount of time, I'm going to avoid talking about the story and major discoveries I found as not to spoil anything meaningful. I will talk generally though about stuff like the dungeons as well as the structure of the world, so if you haven't played it yet and care about not knowing anything about the game before going in, skip ahead to June. And then a little bit further because I talk about Tears of the Kingdom there too. For the rest of you though, here are some of my thoughts. One thing I and many others were worried about when Nintendo said they'd be using the same Hyrule was that it would be too much of the same. You'd just be retreading the footsteps you took in Breath of the Wild. But I actually found the reuse of the map to be one of my favorite things about Tears of the Kingdom. As I had a familiarity with its layout and a connection to the various places across it, I found a lot of joy moving from place to place. Where in Breath of the Wild, I found myself asking, what's that over there? In Tears of the Kingdom, the new question was, why is it like that over there? The changes that are brought about by the upheaval added a mystery to nearly every location, and in almost every instance, it was a mystery I felt drawn to because I cared about this Hyrule. Like, the fog around the Lost Woods being far thicker than normal meant something to me because of the connection I had made to the place when playing Breath of the Wild. The history I had with Hyrule made every interaction more interesting. I wasn't saving a world that I didn't know or remember, I was saving one that I had already spent an entire game saving. And I found this approach to be super rewarding, and it led to me exploring just as much as I did in Breath of the Wild, if not more. Obviously though, part of this is just because there is so much more to explore in Tears of the Kingdom, as along with the overworld there are also the Sky Islands and the Depths, the latter being nearly the same size as Hyrule Hyrule itself. Overall, I found both these areas to be awesome additions. Like, I love that the 3 layers you explore all call for you to traverse them in ways that differ greatly from each other. The Sky Islands and the depths give a new level of verticality to the game, and I had a ton of fun going from layer to layer as I moved around the world. It always feels like there's something new to explore. With that said, I do wish there was a bit more to both the Sky Islands and the depths. This is especially true for the Sky Islands, which do have a handful of really fun activities, but aside from the starting area and the dungeons, most of the stuff in the sky is not all that substantial, and too many of the puzzles up there had the exact same solution of making a plane with the supplied parts to fly to where you need to go. I wish there had been a couple more big areas in the sky with different activities to engage with. As for the depths, between Zonite and the various gear spread across it, there's always a good reason to explore and engage with pretty much everything you come across. Also, some of the best quests in the game are found down there, so I don't want to complain too much about it not having enough stuff because there is plenty to love. But given the sheer size of it, I did find myself wishing there had been a few more meaningful and massive structures to explore down there that yielded some unique reward. I understand that it's not meant to feel as densely packed as the overworld, but I do think they could have filled it a bit more than they did. I guess my point is, the depths are awesome, but they could have been better. Which, in fairness, saying that something could have been better is a statement that pretty much applies to everything ever. Jumping to how the game rewards players, in general, Tears of the Kingdom does a much better job than its predecessor. By introducing the fuse mechanic, players are incentivized to engage in combat way more, because the best way to create a strong weapon is by gathering monster parts. I am a long-time defender of the weapon durability in Breath of the Wild, but it obviously wasn't perfect, as players were often better off avoiding combat to save their weapons. But this change largely fixes that. It makes combat more meaningful because it always rewards the player, and I found myself fighting way more enemies than I did in Breath of the Wild because of it. Tears of the Kingdom also just has a lot more stuff to collect. Gone are the days of everything you engage with being a shrine or a Korok, and a lot of the new things give you pretty useful and fun stuff. Now, the rewards aren't perfect. Pretty much everything you come across will fit into one of the major categories of collectibles, and while this is usually fine, I do wish there were a few more unique rewards to get. Like, there is nothing quite as deflating as doing a long and intriguing quest line that promises mystery and intrigue, only to be given a heart or stamina vessel at the end of it. Again, this feeling isn't one I ran into a ton, but it happened enough times where it stood out, and I just think the game would have benefited so much by including rewards that are unique to specific quests. And like, it does this a few times, but it's usually weapons that break, and I think instead of that they should have given weapons that recharge or something along those lines, or upgrades to Link's core abilities. Also, in regards to the various bits of gear you find across the world, while I do love the inclusion of them, I think it would have been nice if there had been a little more fanfare around finding them instead of it just being something you can stumble across. Now, my least favorite reward in the game is the one you get for beating the dungeons, the Sage's Vows. And it's a shame because the vows and sages in general are so close to being really cool, but instead feel clunky and too situational to be useful. For the most part, I love how the sages operate within the dungeons themselves. It felt similar in a lot of ways to classic Zelda dungeons that require you to use an item to get through them. I will say it would have been better if their abilities had been needed for the vast majority of puzzles within the dungeon, but in general, it felt like a step in the right direction in order to bridge the gap between old Zelda dungeons and the Divine Beasts. All in all, it's a really cool idea that may not be executed perfectly, but is still pretty enjoyable. Outside of the dungeons though, with the exception of Tulin, they kinda just get in the way. Given that you have to be next to them to activate their power, it is difficult to make their abilities a regular part of your arsenal. When trying to use them, I felt like I was always chasing them down instead of actually fighting enemies. Also, I don't like the way the avatars look. It felt goofy having a little blue guy following me around everywhere, especially because I like the feeling of loneliness that both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom evoke, and having a spirit fly in and out of me constantly kinda killed the vibe. In fairness, one of the themes of this game is that Link is no longer alone, that he has friends by his side whenever he needs them, which is obviously why Nintendo included the avatars, but I don't think having lifeless, ghost-looking versions of your companions does a great job of creating that feeling. I think it would have been better if they just looked like they normally did. I ended up turning them off for pretty much much my entire playthrough, as I prefer to not have them running around all the time. And while playing that way was preferable for me, it did make it so beating the dungeons didn't feel nearly as exciting. I pretty much lost out on a reward because I didn't have a practical reason to use it, which kinda sucks. I found myself missing how the champion abilities worked in Breath of the Wild, and I really wish that the sage abilities had been more like those, by being bound to specific inputs on the controller instead of to the proximity of a character. Now, aside from that, I really loved the dungeons in this game. I do think they all could have benefited from being a bit longer, but it was nice to return to some interestingly themed spaces and also have proper Zelda boss fights. There was a cohesion to the dungeons that was really nice and didn't come at the cost of abandoning the design philosophy that I love so much about these games. As for the major mechanics, Link's new abilities are all really cool and offer so many options of how to engage with the world and puzzles. I truly feel like I barely scratched the surface of their potential, and I definitely can see myself jumping back into it just to experiment with them. While not every puzzle in this game is created equal, I did find the majority of them to be satisfying to solve, and given the flexibility of Link's abilities, the solution always felt unique to me, which I really liked. It just always made me feel smart and creative in a way few games have ever been able to do. Lastly, and I won't give any specifics about it, the end of the game is incredible. After beating it, I immediately watched back the recording of my last hour, and I plan to go back and play through the final section again because it is just so cool. It is easily my favorite ending to a Zelda game, and probably just behind Outer Wilds for favorite endings of all time. I don't know that it'll hit everyone in the same way as it hit me, but man, did I just enjoy the shit out of it. I have way more thoughts about the game, but I don't want this to turn into a massive review, as that's not really the nature of this series. And also, I want to save a bunch of my thoughts for videos I plan to make about it on my main channel. So I'll leave it with this. Tears of the Kingdom is the most impressive game I have ever played, and I've never had an experience like it before. Playing it gave me a sense of joy that no other title has. It tries a lot of things, many of which work really well, but obviously, especially due to its scope, it has plenty of shortcomings. I've seen some people say they don't know how it gets better from here, and I am in the opposite camp. I think there are so many ways to improve upon the ideas both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom have established and explored. And that's what's so exciting about it. These two games are two of my favorite experiences ever, and there is so much untapped potential within them. This approach to game design can be done so much better, and I'm beyond excited to see talented developers, whether it be Nintendo or someone else, continue to iterate on the ideas that make these games so special, because I want to keep having amazing experiences like this one. Yeah, it's really good. Then in June, if you can believe it, I played even more Tears of the Kingdom. As I said earlier though, I want to save a lot of my remaining thoughts for other projects, but I did come up with a handful of smaller things in the game that I really liked and don't imagine I will ever focus on in a different video. So here is a list of 7 little things about Tears of the Kingdom I found to be really neat. The first is that Link hums to himself while he cooks stuff. It is such a tiny and pointless touch that I love dearly. I forget all the tunes he hums, but he does like the Ballad of the Windfish and Zelda's Lullaby, and I just find it to be charming and a nice connecting tissue to the other games. The second thing is the stabilizer. The way this device works is when you hit it, it stands up. I don't know, I just think it has a lot of cool potential uses, the most obvious of which is creating a catapult, something I did a bunch of times, and I hope someone smarter than me makes an awesome elaborate device based around it. Third is that the HUDless option takes Link's hearts off the screen. I love only seeing information when I need to see it, and I really enjoyed not having anything to distract from the world. With that said, there should be more customization options for the HUD. It being all or nothing is not ideal. They could have done a lot better. The fourth thing is that the sound Tulin makes when you use his gust ability is very similar to the bird whistle in Twilight Princess. It's a nice callback, and clearly I am a sucker for fan service. Fifth is the minecart shield. It's just a cool fusion that is fun to mess around with. Also, it's a combination I expect a lot of players will run into pretty early on, and acts as a good way to show off that there are tons of wild fusions in the game that can be surprisingly useful. Sixth is skydiving. They really nailed the animations and general feeling of it. Every jump felt exciting, and I loved going into the fast dive dive and just barely landing in what I was aiming for. Very cool stuff. And the last thing I liked is the Stable Trotter's rendition of the Stable theme, which is Epona's Song. It's a beautiful version of a classic Zelda tune, and I love that it does the Terrytown thing of having the song change as you bring in more members. Yeah, that's a good list for now. Moving on, once I rolled credits on Tears of the Kingdom, I replayed the Swapper in order to have footage of it for a main channel video, and revisiting it was a lot of fun. While it wasn't the first indie game I ever played, it was one of my earlier exposures to them, so I have a bit of a soft spot for it. Its core gimmick is that you make copies of yourself that you can move your consciousness between. The clones mimic your movement, but only the version that you are actually controlling can collect the orbs you need in order to progress. The main obstacle you have to figure out how to work around are the different colored lights that limit your powers in various ways. The blue lights don't allow you to create clones within them, the red lights don't let you transfer your consciousness through it, and the purple lights don't allow you to do either. There are so many rooms in this game that you'll walk into, see the light patterns, and think this is impossible, which makes actually figuring it out feel incredible. In general, I think clones are a really good mechanic for a puzzle game, and there aren't enough titles that use them, so I find myself thinking about this game often. In my main channel video, I talked a bit about the story and got a bunch of comments saying that it kind of has Soma vibes. And yeah, it 100% does. I think if you like Soma's narrative, then you'll find a lot of stuff to like here as well, even though it isn't nearly as story focused. It also explores the idea of swapping consciousnesses in a different way than Soma, which is nice too. But yeah, it's a classic indie game that I think has mostly been overshadowed by its contemporaries, so if you haven't given it a shot yet, consider it. The last game I played in June was Cassette Beasts, a title that takes a good chunk of inspiration from Pokemon, but distinguishes itself in a bunch of notable ways. Interestingly enough, I had finished writing the script for my indie game recommendation video when I started playing Cassette Beasts, but after an hour of trying it out, I knew I had to add it to the list because I was enjoying it so much. One regret I have about the way I pitched the game in that video is I mostly only talked about the combat, which is worth focusing on as it does some interesting things with type matchups and monster fusions, but there is a ton of other cool stuff about Cassette Beasts that I neglected to bring up. So I want to touch on some of that here. Arguably, the biggest thing to note is that it's an open world game. Similarly to most open world games, there is a loose progression path players will most likely follow due to the layout of the world and the fact that certain areas have higher leveled enemies. But unlike most open world games, you don't have to complete the main objectives in a specific order. On your journey, your primary goals will be battling rangers who are this game's equivalent to gym leaders, uncovering train stations that house the bosses who hold the secret of the island, and helping out your companions with various personal quests. And you are free to do these things pretty much whenever you want. Like, there's a ranger you're intended to fight first and a different one you're intended to fight last, but you theoretically can fight them in any order you want. All in all, I think the structure of how it uses its open world is solid. It gives enough guidance to give players a satisfying sense of progression, but also gives them a ton of freedom to explore the areas that intrigue them the most and take on any challenge they come across, even if they're underleveled. Also, if you've actually been watching this video and not just listening to me talk while you have it playing in a different tab or second monitor, you've probably noticed that the monsters actually roam around the world itself. I love this choice because I much prefer combat being triggered by me running into something than a random encounter. It allows you to feel in control of your experience, making running around the world feel a lot better because you aren't being stopped out of the blue. What makes exploring even more fun is that capturing certain monsters gives you abilities you can use out of combat. This not only incentivizes catching as many beasts as possible so that you can get all of the abilities, but it also gives you new ways to engage with the world, whether that be reaching areas that would otherwise be inaccessible or solving puzzles. You can also use some of these abilities to help out with combat. For instance, there's a dash you can get, and if you run into an enemy while using it, they take a bit of damage at the start of the fight. Overall, it's a cool mechanic that brings together combat and exploration in a neat way. Yeah, that's most of what I wish I had covered in the main channel video, and hopefully it gives you a fuller picture of what the game has to offer. And this leads us to July. I started with Prodigal, an indie game that takes a lot of inspiration from 2D Zelda titles, primarily ones found on the Game Boy, and it was an utter blast. It's got a lot of great dungeons, some really cool items that have solid puzzles designed around them, a slew of interesting bosses, although I did feel that some of them were a bit too easy, and tons of memorable characters that make engaging with the world and story feel worthwhile. In it, you play as a guy who is returning to his hometown after learning his parents passed away, and his connection to to the town is complicated as he left in a pretty dramatic fashion, stealing a ton of money from his parents and disappearing in the night. Many of the people in town resent him for leaving his family in the way he did, and a lot of the drive behind completing the various quests is to redeem him and restore the relationships he strained. There are even some light dating sim elements, and as you build friendships and romantic relationships, you unlock more quests and dungeons. By tying these things to characters, it makes you feel more connected to the town, and it eventually feels like a place that actually matters, that you actively want to protect. And for those of you who are big fans of post-game content, Prodigal has a ridiculous amount of it. I played the game for around 16 hours, and about half of that time was spent doing stuff post-credits so that I could get the true ending. And I almost never do post-game content, so the fact that I did so much of it here is a testament to how much I enjoyed Prodigal. Colorgrave, the developers of the game, went from being a studio I hadn't heard of before to one I am now keeping a close eye on, as they have a tremendous amount of talent. All in all, it's a really fun game that iterates on what makes titles like Link's Awakening so enjoyable, leading to something that any fan of 2D adventure games should check out. After that, I played Remnant 2. Before I jump into my thoughts about it, I do want to give the disclaimer that I received a free early copy of this game so I could play it with Iron Pineapple for a sponsored video on his channel. While I was in a sponsored video, I personally have not been sponsored. I was not paid to play Remnant 2 or talk about it or be in the video, and I have no obligations to Gearbox or Gunfire Games. Point being, my thoughts on the game here are not being filtered by anyone else. I have no financial benefit or legal obligation to say nice things about it. However, if you think me getting the game for free may influence the way I feel, then take everything I say with a grain of salt. With all that out of the way, Remnant 2 is pretty good. In general, playing games with friends makes every title way more fun, even if it's kind of bad. And a huge part of my enjoyment of Remnant 2 came from being able to play it with Pine and Yako. But it also helped a ton that the game is actually good. The enemies and bosses are really well designed, leading to a ton of engaging fights where you're dodging attacks, exploiting weak spots, and doing what you can to fill whatever role your class calls for. I found the boss fights to be especially fun. Almost all of the ones we did were intense and creative, and figuring out how we could work together to overcome them felt satisfying. Now, one really cool thing about the game that I also think kind of holds it back in some ways is the way it uses procedural generation. Essentially, there are a handful of worlds you explore throughout the game, and the one you start in is randomly selected when you create a new character. From my understanding at least, each world is constructed by pulling from a large pool of quests, bosses, and sub-areas, and then stitching them together to create a cohesive map. This gives it a ton of replayability, as on a second playthrough, you'll most likely have an entirely new set of quests and bosses, which is a great approach for a multiplayer game that you'll probably be interested in playing with different groups of friends. A problem that comes from this, though, is that depending on what content you get served and in what order, the quality of your experience may vary. For instance, we started in this futuristic space zone, and while I think there is a lot of cool stuff and gameplay to be experienced there, the general aesthetic is not one I'm super interested in, so it took me until hitting some other areas to really get invested in the game. Also, while I do think most of the content is pretty good, it is a bit of a bummer that it can take multiple playthroughs to encounter certain bosses. There is a way to essentially re-scramble each of the worlds without having to start New Game Plus, but the aspects are still chosen at random, so you're at the mercy of the generator. This isn't the worst thing in the world, but it is a slightly annoying consequence of this approach to replayability. Now, I imagine the big question a lot of people will have is whether or not it is worth playing single player. And to be honest, I really don't know. I've played a little bit on my own and watched a few streams of people playing solo, and I walked away feeling like the game was clearly designed to be played with a group. Without other people to split enemy focus between, it changes the dynamics of fights in a way that I don't think fully benefits a game centered around ranged combat. If you're interested in it but don't have a group to play with, I definitely recommend looking for reviews from people who played through it alone to see how they felt. However, if you do have people to play it with, it is some of the most fun I've had in a while and is an easy recommendation. Once that was done, I played Metroid Prime Remastered. I don't know if anyone knew this already, but Metroid Prime is really good. I am a latecomer to the Metroid series. My first experience with it was playing Super Metroid around the time I started my main channel, and since then I've been slowly working my way through the series. I've done most of the 2D games, but this was the first time I've ever even touched one of the Prime games, and now I am faced with the hard decision of whether or not I should wait for 2 and 3 to get the remaster treatment or just play one of the older versions, as I loved Metroid Prime so much and just want more of it. The Metroid series has always been a masterclass in world design, atmosphere, and exploration, exploration, and I truly think it is at its best here. Bringing the Metroid formula to a 3D space gives everything so much more life. It makes the many secrets hidden around the world far more fun to find, as the ways they are tucked into the various corners of the map are more complex than they could ever really be in a 2D game. Its approach to progression is largely the same as every other Metroid game, with you getting upgrades that allow you to access different areas, but there was something about how it worked in Prime that just felt so much more satisfying to me. Getting a new power and then remembering some feature in a different location that I could now interact with was wildly rewarding. Again, while this is how most Metroid games work, I think it hit me harder here because Prime often puts a lot of space between objectives, and when playing without hints turned on, it puts onus on the player to pay attention to the world. And due to it being a 3D space that feels so alive, I felt far more connected to the place I was exploring. I didn't have to interpret what certain pixels were supposed to represent. I could just see it rendered all in front of me. From what I've heard, this is a pretty faithful remaster, which frankly blows my mind as there are very few 3D games from the early 2000s that have this amount of polish in terms of level layout and world design. It's an incredible game that feels so far ahead of its time, and I'm mostly just annoyed with myself for not having gotten to it sooner. The last game I played in July was Sheepo, a short and sweet platforming-focused Metroidvania where your character is tasked with gathering eggs of alien species as a part of a research mission with the ultimate goal of learning about every organism in the universe. Obtaining the various eggs allows you to shapeshift into their respective creatures when you encounter them in the world, and using these different forms is how you're able to reach new areas and complete your mission. The movement feels great, which leads to a lot of fun platforming, and while at first I was a bit annoyed that I could only use the abilities in designated spots, having it be restricted in the way it is ends up leading to a lot of cool puzzles and platforming challenges. Along with that, there are also a handful of creative boss fights, and I am using the term fight here pretty loosely as the game doesn't really have any combat, so these encounters are mostly just avoiding attacks until you do something that makes the boss hit themselves. But regardless, they're still cool. In general, the game has a good balance of being challenging enough to get you to feel engaged, but also being super chill, allowing for a lot of enjoyment to come from just exploring the beautiful areas and uncovering some secrets. It's certainly not the most complex Metroidvania out there. If you're looking for a super meaty game to get lost in, this probably isn't the one for you. But if you enjoy charming titles with solid mechanics that don't overstay their welcome, you should give it a look. Similarly to Colorgrave, I'm now interested to see more from Kyle Thompson, the developer of this game, as I know he is currently working on another Metroidvania that looks awesome, and also put out a different one last year that seems great, and I am sure will show up in one of these videos sooner or later. Next up, we've got August. I started off with Viewfinder, a puzzle game with the core mechanic of taking pictures and placing them in the space around you, causing them to become physical things you can interact with. For instance, if there is a big gap in your way, you can take a picture of a bridge and place it over that gap to get across. For a little while, I was a bit worried that things wouldn't get much more complicated than this, but the game does a very good job of ramping up the complexity as you go along. They introduce a lot of interesting mechanics that I never would have thought of, and all of them manage to fit the vibe and theme of the game. I think what makes or breaks a lot of puzzle games, and honestly I guess most games really, is how they are paced, and I found Viewfinder's pacing to be pretty solid. Each stage shifted things up enough to always keep my brain turning, and its difficulty largely stayed in the window of never being boringly easy while also never becoming annoyingly hard, although it definitely leans closer to the easier side of things. I did sometimes find it tough to get pictures to be placed in the exact way I wanted them to be, but the devs seemingly figured this would happen a fair bit, so one of the other mechanics is a rewind function that lets you jump back to just before you placed a picture. This makes it so you never get punished for experimenting, which is great. Now, my main critique of Viewfinder is admittedly a silly one, but it did have a negative effect on my playthrough. There are various companions who talk to your character throughout the journey, and their dialogue ranges from okay to annoying. The part about it that bothered me the most is that when you complete some puzzles, one of them will say stuff like, "That's a clever solution," and it immediately made me feel like it wasn't a clever solution, as it clearly was what the designers intended for me to do. It took moments where I actually did feel clever for solving something and turned them into ones where I felt the developers were clever for how they designed it. And like, it is true that they are, and they do deserve tons of credit for it. But this game and puzzle games in general clearly want players to feel like they are the genius, and lines like this seem to be an attempt to bolster that feeling. But for me at least, it had the opposite effect. To be clear, I don't think this is a good reason to not play the game. It is one of the most creative and engaging puzzlers I've experienced in a while. If you like Portal or any of the first-person puzzle titles that are clearly inspired by Portal, you will really enjoy this. But I do think its use of dialogue is a good reminder that not every game needs it, and if it's not implemented carefully, it can pull players out of the experience. After that, I started Baldur's Gate 3. Typically when I talk about a game in these videos, I've beaten it or I'm at least pretty close to beating it, but that is very much not the case here. I've put in around 20 hours, which with most games you'd think is a lot, but I still feel as if I've barely scratched the surface. I think I might be close to the end of Act 1, but I could be very wrong on that. It's kind of hard to tell. So far though, I am thoroughly enjoying it. I've never really gotten deep into a CRPG before, aside from Disco Elysium, which honestly is kind of a different beast. I did put a few hours into Pillars of Eternity and Divinity Original Sin 2, but got distracted by other games and never came back around to them. I say all this mostly to make it clear that I don't have much to compare Baldur's Gate 3 to, as I lack experience in the genre, so it is possible that other CRPGs have crafted experiences that don't feel terribly off from Baldur's Gate 3, but something about this game does feel really special, and I think that sense is well backed. It has done something that no other CRPG has been able to do, which is to break out into the mainstream. I think there are a ton of factors as to why it has been so successful, but the core of it is simply that Larian developed a deep RPG with a ridiculous and incredible scope that gives players a meaningful sense of freedom. In addition, its presentation is incredible. Every conversation is fully voice acted and animated, which makes the characters and world as a whole feel so alive. While this isn't the first CRPG to have these things, it doesn't seem like any others have gotten anywhere close to this kind of quality, and I think its level of polish makes it look and feel like what most people expect from a AAA title in a way that other CRPGs don't. This helps highlight its best attributes, arguably the most important of which being its cast of characters, who all have intriguing backstories that I constantly find myself wanting to know more about, and cool abilities that make me wish I could have more than 3 of them traveling with me at any given time. They all just feel very D&D. And honestly, that's one thing I really love about Baldur's Gate 3. It actually feels like playing D&D. And I don't just mean because it uses 5e or that there are a ton of ways things can play out. It's more that it has the spirit of what home games often feel like, in that it balances seriousness with silliness in a near perfect way. The stakes are heavy and intriguing, and they push the story and characters forward, but there is also a lot of room for levity, whether that be approaching situations in the stupidest ways imaginable or just having goofy conversations with NPCs. There's just an energy about it that reminds me of playing D&D with friends, and it's cool that they were able to pull this off. Obviously, it doesn't have the same flexibility that actual D&D has, as a real DM is able to adapt in ways that a game can't, and unless you are playing it with a group of friends, no video game can top the magic that happens at a table, but it is the closest one has ever come to it. Now, I will say, while I can clearly see that Baldur's Gate 3 has a ton of potential, I don't feel as if I've seen that potential be fully realized yet. Like, I've enjoyed the robustness of the combat and character interactions, but I haven't really hit a moment yet where I've done something and thought, damn, I can't believe I was able to do that. Given the core mechanics along with some items I've collected and spells I've learned, I think that moment will come pretty soon, and probably be followed by many more moments that elicit the same reaction. But I guess I had just hoped that it would have happened by now. Pushing enemies off of cliffs and placing explosive barrels by big groups is fun, but I want to find some more creative ways to engage with encounters that leave me feeling truly wowed. If Baldur's Gate 3 can live up to its potential, it probably will become one of my favorite games of all time. So here's hoping that happens. I'll update you all as I continue to work through it. The third and final game I played in August was Slay the Spire, which was chosen for me by my patrons. Thank you, you're all chads. I'm not a huge fan of roguelites. I've played a decent amount of them, and while I get that a big reason people love them so much is because they tend to provide countless hours of gameplay where no 2 runs feel exactly the same, the open-ended nature of them kind of stresses me out. I like when games have definitive endings, where I can walk away from it feeling like I've accomplished what I was supposed to accomplish. And with most roguelites, that's either impossible or takes hundreds of hours, and there are too many games I want to play for me to dedicate that much time to a single one. Because of all that, going into Slay the Spire, I didn't really expect it to be my thing, but as it turns out, it very much is. Most of my favorite board games are deck builders, so it drew me in very quickly. There are so many synergies between cards, and figuring out which ones work best on any given run is wildly satisfying. With the right planning, pretty much every card can be viable to incorporate into a deck, and while I certainly did find myself coming back to certain combinations, it never felt like I was just following a meta. I always had to adjust based on the options I was presented with and find ways to make my deck as effective as possible. Over the course of a few days, I put in around 25 hours, clearing the Spire with each of the characters and beating the Corrupted Heart with Silent. And even though there is a ton more I could do, it felt like a pretty good stopping point. Now, for big fans of Slay the Spire, they would probably consider where I stopped to pretty much be the start of the game, as I quit before engaging at all with Ascension mode. For those unfamiliar, Ascension augments the difficulty by adding additional rules that make things way harder. I think the challenges it presents seem pretty interesting, but I didn't feel all that compelled to try it, partly because there isn't an in-game reason to. Doing it doesn't unlock new abilities or progress the story, it's just a challenge you can do if you want. The motivation has to come from an intrinsic place, which I feel a bit mixed about. On one hand, I kinda wish the game had given me a reason to care about Ascension. Like, I love the way Hades incorporated a similar mechanic in the form of heat. As you add heat modifiers to runs, it not only increases the difficulty, but it also makes it so you can collect certain items again that can be used to unlock weapons and other things, so it feels like a core part of the progression. Had Slay the Spire incentivized me to engage with Ascension by similar means, I would have been far more likely to try it. On the other hand though, if it had given me more of a reason to do it, Slay the Spire would probably be the only game I'd play for the next year, as getting to Ascension 20 with each of the characters would almost certainly take me hundreds of hours. And in all honesty, I'd probably quit at some point, which would leave me feeling a bit unfulfilled. Having it be presented in the way it is let me avoid that feeling of failure by giving me a pretty good spot to end off. All in all, it is a really solid game and drew me in a way that roguelites rarely do. After all that, September began, and it was a pretty good month. I started off with Rain World, an atmospheric platformer where you navigate a brutal landscape in an effort to reunite the playable character with their family. To be honest, I'm a little surprised by how much and how quickly I fell in love with this game. I don't want to say that it isn't for everyone because that might make you think you shouldn't try it, but it certainly is a title that asks a lot from the player. It asks them to learn their place within the ecosystem of the world through observation instead of direction. It asks them to work through large chunks of the game without really knowing how many mechanics work, and it asks them to often rethink what progress looks like. Putting this much responsibility onto the player is a hard ask, and a hard thing to properly balance. There is a fine line between intrigue and annoyance, and even if a developer tunes things just right, the player also has to be in a state of mind where they are willing to embrace it. And I 100% was. I adored figuring out bits and pieces of how the world, the creatures within it, and my character worked, so that I could use it all to my advantage in order to move from one area to the next. It's funny looking back at the footage of the gameplay, as it doesn't look like much, but in the moment I was completely immersed. Like, I don't know that I've ever felt as much exhilaration while playing a game as I did when juking these lizards. There is so much depth to this title, and I don't want to say much more about it, as half the joy comes from the little discoveries you'll make throughout your playthrough. This is an experience that I think some of you will really love. Like, it will become your favorite game ever kind of love. And I think others of you will quit after an hour of pure frustration and never look back at it. And to be clear, I don't think there is anything wrong with that. If you find it to be a miserable game to play, then you find it to be a miserable game to play. However, I would encourage you all to at the very least give it a try, because there is something really unique and special about how it works and feels to play. And even if you don't think you like unforgiving games, there's a chance you'll love this one. While I was playing Rain World, I ended up rage quitting fairly frequently because life comes at you fast, and you'd think when I did that I'd jump over to something chill and easy as a sort of palate cleanser, but instead I kept jumping back into Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy. I first beat Getting Over It in 2020, and the most interesting thing about coming back to it now is how much my relationship with the game has changed. That first playthrough was met with constant failure and frustration. I lost track of how many times I fell back to the bottom, and getting to the end took a tremendous amount of patience and effort. The thing is though, and anyone who's beaten the game can attest to this, after clearing it once, it really isn't hard to clear a second time, or a third, or a 20th. By that point, you've developed skills and more importantly knowledge about the controls and map that make it kind of a breeze to get past. I think my first playthrough took around 12 hours, and now I can pretty consistently beat it in 15 to 20 minutes. It's kind of the perfect length for when I want to play a game but don't want to dedicate a bunch of time to something bigger. So when I found myself between sessions of Rain World and the other games I played in September, it was an easy one to turn to. As odd as it sounds, it helped me relax. Without the fear of potentially never being able to get good enough to finish the game, I was able to just enjoy swinging through it, never getting too bothered with any loss of progress because I now have the skill to get back to where I was in just a few minutes. I find that a lot of hard games end up feeling like this once you've played them enough, and it's a pretty cool thing to experience. You get to view it from a new angle and play with a new purpose in mind. I wouldn't say I have mastered Getting Over It, but I am good enough where playing it now feels like an entirely different game than it once did, and it mostly comes down to me being skilled, which is a great feeling. I think this title gets written off as just being rage bait, and obviously it is trying to be to a degree, but also it has surprisingly fun and deep movement tech, as well as really thought-provoking musings on art and game design from Foddy himself that I enjoy listening to every run. If you've only beaten Getting Over It once, I would strongly suggest playing through it at least one more time, as it is super fulfilling to see how far you've come. And if you've never played it because you either wrote it off or watched a streamer do it, I'd say try it out for yourself, as you might be surprised by how fun it is once you get a hang of it. Continuing the trend of me playing games designed to kick the player's ass, I got sent a review code for Lies of P, a title that unabashedly wears its FromSoft influence on its sleeve, but does manage to provide an experience that feels different from the games it takes inspiration from. It centers around a parry system, which has led a lot of people to draw comparisons between it and Sekiro. But I will say, if you try to use its parry in the exact same way as you would in Sekiro, you'll have a bad time, as the system is less about learning to block every attack and more about combining blocks and dodges effectively to take as little damage as possible. This creates a unique flow to combat that pushes you to fully understand how your kit works and learn the movesets of every enemy you face. Like Sekiro, it has a posture system where if you deflect enough hits and do enough damage, the enemy gets staggered. One big difference here though is that to complete the stagger, you need to hit them with a charge attack before the window ends, which I can see some people being frustrated by, but I thought it created a cool moment where you have to quickly determine the best way to get a hit in without being too greedy and getting hit yourself. It's high risk and high reward, and I find that sort of thing adds a lot of excitement to fights. I will say, I kind of wish there had been a visible posture meter like there is in Sekiro, as I think that helps build up suspense, as when you get close to breaking an enemy's posture, you're more likely to take risks to make sure the posture doesn't go back down. You do develop a sense for how much it takes to stagger an enemy after a few times fighting one, so it isn't a huge deal, but I would have preferred to have the information. As for stuff other than the combat, it has an actually pretty good story that is far less cryptic than what we've come to expect from Souls-likes, making it easy to follow and connect to without needing VaatiVidya to tell us what makes it so good. It's also got a killer aesthetic that, yeah, is reminiscent of Bloodborne at a glance, but when you actually get into the game and see more of the areas, it differentiates itself enough to feel unique. Lastly, it has tight level design that loves to loop back around on itself in fun ways. It feels like the devs really loved the first level in Demon's Souls and decided to design every area with a similar philosophy. All in all, this is the first Souls-like I've played that has been able to get anywhere close to FromSoft quality, and I would highly recommend it to anyone who likes the genre. To finish off the month, I started Sea of Stars, which was chosen for me by my benevolent and all-powerful patrons. Full disclosure, it is a pretty long game, so I have not had the chance to get super deep into it yet. From what I have played though, it is really good. The art style is charming, the music is all sorts of nostalgic, and the world building is intriguing. It also proves that turn-based RPGs can, in fact, be fun as hell. Honestly, I'm still early enough in the game where new things are being introduced, so I am sure I will have more to say in a future month's video, but so far, the battle mechanics are just so cool. For starters, it has timed hits, which is always fun, and also there is an awesome weakness and stagger system where you're shown how many turns an enemy has until their next move, and if you can hit them with the proper attacks in that time frame, they will get stunned out of using it. This creates a lot of interesting decision making where you have to consider what combination of moves will lead to you taking the least amount of damage possible. Every fight kind of feels like a puzzle, which keeps things engaging. To make things feel even better, there are no random encounters. Every enemy appears on the map and you seamlessly jump between exploration and combat. Also, it does something I haven't seen an RPG do before, where when one of your characters hits 0 HP, instead of needing to be revived with an item, they just get back up on their own at half health after a few turns. And the more times they get knocked out in a battle, the longer it will take for them to get back in the fight. I really like this system, as it makes keeping my characters alive feel more meaningful, because letting them get knocked down could lead to not being able to use them for a good while. Whereas in something like Final Fantasy, if you have enough Phoenix Downs, it doesn't really matter how many times one character gets knocked out as long as others are still up. This gives more weight to fights, and it's also just nice to not have to always be stocked up on 100 revives to make sure you never run out. So yeah, so far it is really promising, and I am excited to jump back in and play more of it. I will keep you posted as I get further. In October, I did not get further, but I did revisit a handful of games I really adore. I started the month with Demon's Souls. I needed to get footage of it and a few other FromSoft games for a video on my main channel, and it was really interesting to go back to it for the first time in over a decade. I opted to replay the PS3 version instead of going to the remake, mostly mostly because I felt like it would make more sense within the framework of my video. In it, I talk a bunch about what it was like for me when I played Demon's Souls for the first time, so using footage from a version that came out just a few years ago seemed off. And I'm really glad I went this route, as I think the vibes of the original Demon's Souls are just unparalleled. There's nothing really like it. Its music and aesthetic are just so powerful, and while the remake is gorgeous in its own right, it doesn't conjure the same emotions. Now, because I was playing it to get specific shots for my video, I definitely approached it in a suboptimal way. I wanted to recreate what my first playthrough was like, which meant picking the ranger and cheesing most of the bosses with a bow. Demon's Souls was the first FromSoft game I ever played, and it was far too hard for me at the time. I struggled to kill anything when using melee, so I'd avoid it whenever possible and use every cheap trick at my disposal. In fairness, I do think Demon's Souls is designed in a way that unintentionally pushes players to do this. There are a few levels that loop around on themselves with shortcuts, creating relatively quick runs to the boss once you've worked your way through the level once, but the majority of them aren't like that. Most are just long, fairly linear paths to the fog gate. Getting through each stage is challenging and time consuming, and once you reach the boss, the idea of having to do it all over again is terrible. Given that healing items don't replenish when you die or use an archstone, there's a pretty good chance that you will have to use a substantial amount of your healing on the way to the boss, meaning if you die when fighting one, you're most likely going to have to grind to get more, and you'll be starting from square one as your souls will be all the way at the end of the level. Doing anything you can to make sure you don't have to go through all that is tempting. For most players, there will be a lot of wasted time if they want to actually learn how to take on the bosses without any cheese. In general, Demon's Souls has a ton of grinding. Even if the player doesn't need to grind for souls or healing grass, they almost certainly will have to grind for stones in order to upgrade their weapons. There's just a lot of repetition to the core gameplay loop, which is a shame as it means spending a ton of time doing the least enjoyable things the title has to offer. I know I've spent most of this section complaining about Demon's Souls, but I do think there is something about it that makes it undeniably special. It has so many interesting ideas, plenty of which aren't necessarily balanced in the best way possible, but they do feel fresh even now. Whether it be the world tendency system, or the design of certain encounters, or the many secrets that feel no responsibility to make themselves clear to the player, there are just so many intriguing aspects to Demon's Souls that make it stand out, and FromSoft iterating and expanding on some of them has led to the studio becoming the behemoth it is today. All in all, while there are some design choices that lead to pretty unfortunate behavior, there is still a lot here to enjoy, and if you like FromSoft games but have never tried it, I think at the very least you'll find it to be interesting. After wrapping up Demon's Souls, I moved on to gathering footage for Dark Souls. There is a section of that main channel video I mentioned before that's all about summoning, so I needed to get shots from a bunch of different fights so that I could have some variety. I've always found doing this sort of thing to be a weird part of the job. I try to just record every game I play so that I always have footage, but sometimes I need something more specific. It's certainly possible to get away with using B-roll of pretty unrelated things, but I think it adds a lot to have shots that are relevant to what is being said, at least whenever possible, so that sometimes means replaying large portions of a game to get relevant footage. It's a weird way to replay a game, and I understand that at the end of the day it is still playing a game, but it does feel way more like work than when I'm playing something new. Honestly, Dark Souls might be the game I've replayed the most in order to get specific footage, and you'd think that playing it in this sort of strained way might make me resent it or something, but luckily that has never been the case. I love playing Dark Souls. It's comforting in a way, and even though I firmly believe that the game kinda goes to shit in the second half and has all sorts of balance problems throughout, I still love it for what it introduced me to, and how it changed my view on games in a way no other title has. I also think its art direction and area design are incredible. I love revisiting every location of the game with the exception of Lost Izalith, and yeah, it's just always fun to run another victory lap in Lordran. Using summons on this playthrough was also pretty entertaining as it isn't something I've done a ton. I got to see a lot of Solaire and also a few player summons, which I was a bit surprised on as it's been like 5 years since Dark Souls Remastered came out. I find it pretty cool to still see people putting their summon signs down. Like I said, it's an aspect of these games I rarely engage with, but I do love it conceptually. Getting help from a stranger who you most likely will never see again, whose voice you'll never hear, whose face you'll never know, is kind of beautiful. It's something I wish I could experience more with these titles without feeling like I was making things too easy for myself. But honestly, that might just mean I should be on the other side of it more often and do my part to help those who need it. I feel like I'm losing the plot here, but I guess that kind of speaks to what this replay of Dark Souls was like. I didn't focus much on the game itself, but rather the task at hand of getting the shots I needed, and then some extra that I probably didn't need but figured would be nice to have anyway. Again, this doesn't mean I didn't enjoy it, but it's hard to give a mini review for a game when my playthrough was more about filming than anything else. With Demon Souls, it at least had been over a decade since I last played it, leading to some of it feeling like a new experience, but I replayed Dark Souls like a year or two ago, so nothing felt all that fresh. And at first, I thought I'd feel a similar way with the next game I replayed, Elden Ring, but the playthrough ended up actually showing me a new side to the game. I did it on New Game++, so it really wasn't anything like a typical playthrough, but it was still a fair bit of fun. When you're not starting from a fresh file, there's no real need to explore, so it kind of ends up just feeling like the other Souls games, but every so often you have to ride a horse for 10 minutes. Similar to Dark Souls, I mostly needed footage of summons and spirit ashes on some bosses, as I didn't really do either in my first playthrough, and all of it was fun to mess around with. There are some pretty awesome NPC summons that I did not realize existed, and seeing some of the builds other players have come up with made it very clear that my big sword approach is about as basic as it could possibly get. It very much made me want to experiment with more weapons and spells. I ended up getting way more footage than I needed to because I was having fun, and after beating Morgott, I decided that as I was pretty close, it might be cool to give Malenia a shot. On my first playthrough, she was the lone boss I ended up using a spirit ash on. I fought her for like 3 hours straight, which was probably the most amount of time I had spent on a boss in one of these games since Ornstein and Smo, and I was able to get to her second phase, but not much beyond that. So I ended up deciding to use the Mimic tier as I wasn't progressing fast enough, which actually kind of mattered at the time because the game came out at the end of February and my wife's due date was mid-March, so I had a limited amount of time to beat the game before becoming a dad, and I didn't want to leave anything major unfinished. Without the looming threat of a newborn on the immediate horizon, this seemed like the perfect time to try again. This playthrough of Elden Ring took me about 15 hours to beat, and 9 of those were spent on this fucking fight. Malenia is a menace. She can move in and out of combos with tremendous speed, and so many of her attacks can wipe away your health bar. Also, her AI is the most devious AI I've ever seen. Whenever she is close to using the waterfowl dance, she becomes so much more passive, and she will slowly circle around you, waiting for you to make the mistake of being impatient so that she can ruin your life. And that's just her first phase. Her second is far more deadly. Now, instead of one move that will kill you if you get stuck in it, she has 3, and they are even harder to predict. It actually kinda surprises me that she is in the game because of how bullshit some of the things she can do are. There is no other FromSoft boss like this. And after learning the fight and finally beating her one-on-one, I can honestly say that she might be one of my favorite bosses they've ever made. A common experience with these games is going from feeling like you'd never be able to overcome some challenge to beating anything that gets in your way. Going through that transformation is empowering. It is what has gotten a lot of people to fall in love with FromSoft. But the thing is, in order to keep providing that feeling to returning players, the ante needs to be raised. The bosses need to get harder and harder so that returning players who have figured out these games are still being challenged. And Malenia is the result of FromSoft desperately trying to provide that. While her moveset feels unfair, all of her attacks, including the waterfowl dance, can be dodged. It just takes a lot of trial and error to figure out how, and it takes even more discipline to not be baited into attacking at the wrong time. I don't think she is the most fun Soulsborne boss or the best designed, but she is the one I have spent the most time fighting against by a wide margin. She made me feel that same kind of hopelessness that I felt when I was a newcomer to these games, and that made besting watching her all the more satisfying. With Malenia finally conquered, I went on to beat the rest of the game again too, which wasn't all that eventful, but still fun to run through. All in all, it was neat to play through Demon's Souls, Dark Souls, and Elden Ring within the same month, as I got to see how far FromSoft has come and how much their design has shifted while still being able to hold onto the essence that made people fall in love with them in the first place. To end off the month, I replayed Sekiro. Just kidding. Can you imagine? Now, I played Minit, which was suggested to me by my patrons, and it was okay. It's a short game where you have 60 seconds to explore the world before your character dies. Your progress is carried over from one run to the next, so if you get an important item or open a shortcut, you don't have to worry about doing it again. I am a big fan of titles with timers, but I don't think Minit does enough with its time limit to make it feel special. The inclusion of it does create a little tension by always making you wonder whether or not you'll be able to finish certain tasks within the 60-second time frame, which pushes the player to be more efficient with how they engage with the world, but all things considered, its use of time felt a bit underwhelming. When I first started, I thought it would do some of the things I've come to expect in time loop games, namely having characters and events operate on a schedule that you have to learn in order to solve puzzles, but it really doesn't, at least not enough to feel like an impactful part of the gameplay loop. Even though it often gets pitched as a time loop game and has some moments that make it seem like one, at its core, it's not. For the most part, it just plays like a compact 2D Zelda game, except it is harder to explore because you keep getting resets. I do think the game would be worse without its time limit, as at the very least it forces you to understand the world so you can find the optimal way through it, which is cool, but I couldn't help but feel like it didn't come close to meeting its potential. I don't know, if you're looking for a cute and fun enough way to spend an hour or two, it's worth checking out, but I definitely was hoping for a bit more from it. This leads us to November. I started off with Cocoon, a puzzle game I've been looking forward to for a long while, as its director Jeb Carlson was the lead gameplay designer for both Limbo and Inside, which are two of my favorite puzzle platformers. Pretty much ever since Cocoon's announcement trailer, I've been eagerly awaiting its release, and to no surprise of my own, it's brilliant. The game centers around these orbs, each of which has an unlockable ability that is used to solve the various puzzles you're faced with. Where things get really cool though, is that each of these orbs also contains a world of its own. So the gameplay loop consists of jumping in and out of these orbs to solve puzzles that then unlock their core abilities, and then you use those abilities to reach new areas and find more orbs. This setup leads to some wildly impressive and mind-bending puzzles that feel super satisfying to figure out. They are the sort of puzzles that sound confusing when you try to explain how they work, but the game does such a good job of teaching the player its core concepts that it rarely feels confusing in the moment. I've talked a lot about the puzzle game's sweet spot, of it being hard enough to get the wheels turning, but not so hard that you're staring at the screen for an hour feeling like an idiot, wondering how you managed to make it this far in life if you can't solve a stupid puzzle in a video game, and Cocoon very much lands within that sweet spot. For those who are really good at these types of games, it might be a bit on the easy side, but for the majority of people, I think it'll be the right level of challenge. Now, I will say the game does have a bit of an orb management problem. A lot of time is spent just moving them around to get them in the right configuration, and while I don't want to make this out to be the biggest deal in the world, it can feel a bit unwieldy. Also, sometimes you'll solve a puzzle pretty quickly in your head and then have to spend a minute or so getting everything placed properly before being able to complete it, and I found that this sometimes dampened the excitement that came from solving a puzzle, as I had already done the fun part of figuring it out and then was just left with the somewhat dull task of actually doing it. Again, I don't want to harp on this too much, and I don't even know that there is a good solution for this type of thing. It's sort of just a consequence of the game going with the concept it went with, which in my opinion is well worth this slight disconnect. Also, it's perfectly fine for a game to have downtime. Not every moment needs to be optimized, but it did stick out to me enough here to want to mention it. I would be curious to hear what you all think about this aspect of solving puzzles, as I very much could just be doing a classic Rasputin overthink. Ultimately, it's an incredible game that maybe didn't hit as hard for me as other projects Yeb has worked on, but I imagine for a lot of people it will. It's easily in my top 10 games that came out this year, so you probably should play it. After that, I got back into Sea of Stars, which I started in September but put on the back burner so I could play other games for footage purposes, and overall I really enjoyed it. When I last talked about it, I primarily focused on the combat, and for good reason, as it's a really cool system that calls for a lot of interesting decision making and problem solving. Being able to stun enemies by hitting them with certain types of moves in a set amount of time requires you to understand the full scope of your party's moveset in a way a lot of turn turn-based RPGs don't. One of the best decisions they made related to this is that once you get more than 3 characters in your party, you can still swap between them during combat without having to use up a turn. This not only gives you more options, but it makes it so no character ever gets fully sidelined, which is something I've run into with most RPGs I've played. I'm always bummed when I feel like a character doesn't make sense to use anymore, and Sea of Stars' approach pretty much solves that completely, because you'll need to swap characters regularly to be effective in combat. The battle system just works so well and is easily the part of the game I enjoyed the most. With that said, I did feel like the combat started to wear a bit thin by the end, and honestly I think the game in general wears a bit thin by the end. The last third of it drags some both narratively and gameplay wise, and in general it feels a little less polished. While I did end up liking the game enough to do a bunch of post-game stuff in order to get the true ending, I do still wish it had been a bit shorter. It being as long as it is kind of exposes a handful of issues with the story and especially the characters, who for the most part are pretty surface level. I think part of the problem comes from it being a piece of the greater story that Sabotage Studio is building out with their various games, so there ends up being some pretty important stuff that gets introduced in this story that doesn't really get resolved, as it seemingly will be explored in a future game they make. While I do think this is cool in a lot of ways, it does lead to a few plot points falling flat, and until a payoff happens in a future game, I can't help but feel a bit disappointed by it. Additionally, I also found the exploration to be a little underwhelming. The environments are beautiful, and to get through them you do have to engage with various obstacles, which is more interesting than just running in a straight line, but mostly is just pressing a single input to climb, jump, or sidle. I wish there would have been more things to meaningfully engage with. Like, had they had more puzzles, especially within the various dungeons, I think it would have gone a long way. Most of the ones the game does have can be solved by just looking at them for a second, so it is hard to really call them puzzles. And honestly, I don't even think they were meant to be challenging. They just seem like something that's there to keep the player somewhat engaged between fights, and it is largely successful in that. But as someone who enjoys a good dungeon puzzle, it would have been cool to have them incorporate them. Honestly, the majority of the true puzzles in the game are optional, and a handful of them are really enjoyable, so the team clearly has the skill to make good ones. And yeah, that makes me wish they had made it a core part of the game. All in all, I do think Sea of Stars is a great title that fans of JRPGs, and especially fans of Chrono Trigger, will find a lot of enjoyment in. Despite my complaints here, once I really started to get into it, I could not put it down, even when I felt like it was dragging. There is something special to this game that makes it feel really good to play, and while it did overstay its welcome for me and made some storytelling choices that I didn't love, it's well worth checking out if you like the genre. Once I rolled credits on Sea of Stars, I played Thymesia, a serviceable Souls-like that takes a lot of cues from Sekiro's combat system, but twists it up enough to feel unique. For those of you who haven't played it, which I imagine is a lot of you, you have two kinds of attacks. Your sword attack that primarily does damage to the enemy's white health bar, which is essentially like an overshield, and your claw attack, which primarily does damage to their green health bar, which is their true health. You can only do damage to the green bar if it is not covered by the white one, and if enough time passes without you landing an attack, the enemy's white bar will replenish to however much green health they have left. This leads to an aggressive playstyle where you cycle between chipping away at their white health bar with the sword and then using the claws to make sure the damage stays. Along with using the sword, the other best way to lower the enemy's white bar is by deflecting their attacks, which, as always, feels really good when you're actually able to do it. Altogether, it is a challenging system that takes a bit to get used to, as it calls for a fair bit of precision and skill, but once you figure things out, it feels really satisfying, especially when fighting the bosses, who for the most part are all pretty solid. All of that is what I consider to be the core part of the combat, but there also is a sort of magic system where you can set what's called a plague weapon that spends energy to use a special attack. This adds a bunch of options to your arsenal, many of which are pretty cool. With that said, the game is somewhat short, so by the time you get access to most of them, you'll be done playing, which I don't know, isn't necessarily bad, but it does end up feeling like an overly in-depth system for a game of this scope. And when I look at it compared to other aspects of the game that are a bit underdeveloped, like its level design, it makes me wish they would have polished that stuff to the same level as the combat. Ultimately, I'd say that if you're looking for something to play that scratches the same itch as Sekiro, and you've already beaten Lies of P, you'll find a lot to enjoy with Thymesia, regardless of some of its shortcomings. To end off the month, I played Ghost Trick Phantom Detective, which was chosen for me by my patrons, and I thought it was pretty neat. A handful of people I know have talked it up for a while, so I had somewhat high expectations, and while I wouldn't say it met them completely, it wasn't that far off. In it, you play as a ghost with amnesia who is trying to figure out how and why he died. After becoming a ghost, he gained a variety of special powers, like being able to move between and manipulate various objects. He also is able to communicate with other recently dead people and attempt to save them by traveling back in time to 4 minutes before their death, as that's the rules, I guess. So the gameplay mostly revolves around figuring out how to change the past in a meaningful enough way in order to avert the fate of the various characters who died. A lot of these puzzles are pretty straightforward, but there are a few that take a decent amount of thought and experimentation to figure out, which is when I found the game to be at its best. The tension that comes from having a limited amount of time to solve the problem adds a level of excitement that many puzzle games don't have, and it feels amazing when you figure out what to do just before time runs out. Of course, the trade-off here is that if you don't figure it out in time, you'll have to start over, which leads to some repetition. In fairness, the amount of time it takes to do each puzzle isn't that long, so when you fail, it never feels like a ton of progress is lost, and there also are checkpoints on some of the longer ones. But there were times where I ran into the same issue as the one I mentioned with Cocoon. I would figure out what I needed to do and then had to wait around to be able to do it. It did bother me less with Ghost Trick though, mostly because the puzzles typically call for timing something just right or executing a series of moves quickly enough, and that's a lot more engaging than moving balls around. Again, it's sort of an unavoidable consequence of this kind of setup for a game, so like with Cocoon, I don't know that there's a good solution. Now, while I liked the gameplay, the real star of the show here is the story, which is filled with neat twists and turns, intriguing and over-the-top characters, and countless little mysteries that always had me guessing at what the hell was going on. It's a fun murder mystery that simultaneously doesn't take itself too seriously, but also manages to explore deeper questions. It's a very good time. And finally, that brings us to December. I kicked things off with Jusant, an atmospheric and chill game about climbing to the top of a tower-like mountain. It has similar mechanics to Grow Home and Grow Up if you've played either of those games, where R1 and L1 allow you to move your hands to grab new holds. I always like this approach as it's far more engaging than the way many games do it, where climbing is pretty much automated. To make it so you can't just spam R1 and L1 to get to the top, there are obstacles that require some creative thinking and also a stamina meter you have to manage. The coolest mechanic in the game comes in the form of pitons, which allow you to set an anchor point that not only protects you from falling to the bottom of a section, but also can be used to traverse the mountain in different ways, whether that be swinging or running along the wall to get to a new spot. You can only use 3 at a time, so you have to be strategic with where you place them, especially because you only have so much slack in your rope, and if you set them up in a way that leaves you with no slack, you'll have to go back to take 1 or more of them out. When using the pitons, I felt like I had a ton of freedom over how I approached the wall, which unfortunately can't really be said about the other abilities. Early on, you get this sort of pulse move that will make different fauna and flora react to it. It might cause a vine to grow, or these spark creatures to lift you up, or a few other things. And while they are cool little additions, not much thought goes into engaging with them. Coming across these things is pretty much just a prompt to tell you to use the pulse, but they aren't a part of your climbing kit that you can use strategically. You simply just engage with them when you see them. In general, I find abilities that work this way to be a bit underwhelming, because I want to make decisions on how to best use my moves instead of only using them when the game deems that it is time to use them. Ultimately, I just wish that there was more problem solving in Jusant, as that is such a big part of climbing, but the answer of what you have to do is almost always clear, and as the game is pretty easy, I almost never found myself exhausting the full scope of my climbing kit. To be clear, the gameplay is still enjoyable, but I do wish it had pushed me a bit more. As for the other aspects of the game, it has an intriguing setting with a ton of rich history and unique ideas. For those of you who like to learn about locations long forgotten, there is a lot you'll love here. It is just an awesome place to explore. Also, while I did find the pacing to be a bit off, mostly that the middle chunk drags a bit, they do nail the ending well enough where it's easy to forget the dips. Yeah, it's a cool little game, and if you're watching this thinking, I'd probably like that, then you're probably right. After finishing Jusant, I played a Highland Song, a charming title centered around running through the Scottish hillsides, and it impressed the hell out of me. It has some of the most interesting exploration I've seen in a 2D platformer. Each area has a ton of different layers that you weave between, creating cool moments of discovery when you stumble across a fruitful path, and providing a wild amount to explore within a relatively compact space. It has a depth to its exploration that is rare to find in a 2D title. The Highlands feel endless, painless, and after I finished, it felt like I had barely seen any of it. And I think this is how the devs want you to feel. Honestly, it seems designed with multiple playthroughs in mind. While there is no fail state in the game, the goal is to make your way from the countryside to the coast in a certain amount of time, and you get different endings based on when you reach your destination. The amount of time you have to get there is pretty tight, meaning on a first playthrough, you're not going to explore every nook and cranny, and I think this helps build that sense of these hills going on forever. And along with that, it also creates an air of mystery about what may be hidden in the places you didn't have time to look. It's an effective use of a time limit that makes the world feel fuller and asks the player to constantly make decisions about what path to take, where to rest, and when to take risks. You very much can just ignore the time limit on your first playthrough and still have a fulfilling experience, as it's designed in a way that feels complete whether you hit it or not. And what's cool is that on a second playthrough, all the information you gained on the first carries over, making it much easier to reach the coast in time. Part of me kind of wishes I hadn't made it to the end within the time limit on my first playthrough, so that I would have felt obligated to play it again and see even more of what the game has to offer. I may still go back just for the fun of it, but right now the motivation isn't there, which is kind of a bummer. There are a lot of interesting things going on beneath the surface in terms of design, like how stamina and health work, and while I don't think most of them are as effective as they could be, they are still compelling enough to pull you in. While I did find myself wishing that things had been tweaked a bit to make certain decisions more meaningful, it just made me hope that this studio or another studio iterates on some of the ideas here to make an even more powerful experience. With that, I would still highly recommend this one. It is pretty quick to beat, but also extremely dense, giving tons to do for those interested in exploring every path in the Highlands they can find. Once that was done, I ended off with OneShot, which was suggested to me by my patrons, and while I didn't really love playing it, I did find it very interesting, especially after looking into its development. The core of the game is that you, like actually you, are helping the main character Nico save a mysterious world by bringing light back to it. The game constantly breaks the fourth wall, with Nico addressing you directly, asking about your life, and advice on what to do next. Additionally, it extends beyond the confines of the game window. Pretty much from the onset, you get desktop messages that act as a sort of warning and are tasked with looking through the game's files to do all sorts of creative meta things that lead to fun discoveries and a few neat puzzles. As for the moment-to-moment gameplay, it's pretty much like a point-and-click adventure game where you're gathering items, combining some together, and finding the proper place to use them. Unfortunately, none of these puzzles are all that thought-provoking or satisfying to figure out, so sometimes it just feels like running from one spot to the next without a lot of payoff. I think it's fine for a game to do this, but then it really has to have a solid story and cast of characters to pull you in. And while I didn't find the writing here to be bad, I also didn't connect to anything all that much. The game kind of relies on you feeling a strong connection to both Nico and the wider world, but by the end, I didn't feel like enough had been done for me to really care about any of it. With that said, I do know plenty of people who did feel a strong connection to Nico and the other characters, so if you haven't played it before, your mileage may vary depending on the sort of stuff that resonates with you. Regardless, for me, it didn't land hard enough to be something I'll think back on a ton moving forward. Now, even though I didn't love the game, I do have a lot of respect for it due to its place in this sort of meta video game genre. While it isn't the first title to be based around breaking the fourth wall in interesting ways, it definitely is one of the earlier popular examples, with its original release predating Pony Island, Doki Doki Literature Club, and most notably, Undertale. I don't want to make it sound like OneShot hasn't gotten the recognition it deserves, as it has sold well and received many glowing reviews, but in some ways it has been overshadowed by the success of Undertale, and this is something the developers have acknowledged in interviews as well as in the game itself. There's a character in the updated Steam version that came out in 2016 who is feverishly rewriting their already published book because a more popular author wrote a similar one, and they lament over the fact that despite writing theirs first, they will be seen as a copycat by many who don't know the full history. I think it's interesting that they included this reference to OneShot's relationship with Undertale in this updated version of the game, as it's often an aspect of game development that people don't talk about despite it happening all the time. Really, it happens in most creative fields, and while there's nothing wrong with different artists pursuing similar ideas, it is painful when yours is deemed by many to be a knockoff when it definitively isn't. I just found it all to be intriguing, and I appreciate them being open about it. At the end of the day, I think OneShot is an indie classic and worth playing for the history alone, but I imagine a lot of you will also enjoy the game itself. Anyway, that's all I've got to talk about for now. I will see you next time unless I decide to stop doing this. Bye.